Russian dictator Vladimir Putin threatens the U.S. over the possible supply of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. U.S. President Trump proposed his last-minute offer on Gaza. Meanwhile, U.S. is increasing diplomatic pressure on Cuba in the United Nations. Could Putin prevent the U.S. from supplying missiles to Ukraine, and are Israel and Hamas closer to achieving a ceasefire deal? Russian dictator Vladimir Putin on Thursday issued a warning to the U.S., saying that the potential delivery of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would mark a new stage of escalation in the conflict and could damage diplomatic relations between Washington and Moscow. Speaking at the annual Valdai Discussion Club in Sochi, Putin claims that using Tomahawk would require direct involvement from U.S. personnel. The remarks come amid growing speculation in Washington over whether the Trump administration might greenlight the transfer of long-range missiles to Ukraine, as Ukraine continues to request deep strike capabilities. Although Tomahawk is a decades-old U.S. Navy system, it remains one of the most precise long-range strike conventional weapons in the Pentagon's arsenal. Putin acknowledged the system's power but downplayed the potential impact on the battlefield, calling it not exactly modern and claiming it won't change the balance of power. Despite that assessment, Putin warns that the missiles can cause damage, adding that Russia would intercept them and continue to enhance air defense. So far, U.S. officials have not confirmed any plans to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. However, the idea is reportedly under discussions after the recent gains by Russian troops in eastern Ukraine and mounting calls from Ukraine for long-range weaponry. Vice President J.D. Vance has said the administration is weighing all options, but analysts know that Tomahawk inventory is largely reserved for U.S. Navy use, and relocating them would require sophisticated logistical coordination. Meanwhile, according to the U.S. Institute of Study of War, Putin is escalating diplomatic pressure to dissuade U.S. from sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Institute of Study of War says Putin is intentionally dangling initiatives unrelated to the battlefield in order to extract political concessions from Washington. ICV further assesses that Putin has pushed for rapprochement with the United States as a way to secure Russian objectives, including pressure Trump's administration to reopen arms control talks that could advance Moscow's strategic aims. Putin has combined diplomatic indictment with more direct warnings. On October 2nd, he publicly cautioned that supplying Tomahawk would present a new stage of escalation without presenting independent evidence that American military personnel would have to be directly involved in any Ukrainian strikes. At the same time, Putin sought to undercut the weapons' perceived value, arguing they would not materially change the battlefield balance, a line Moscow has used previously when Washington debated sending ATACMS, F-16s or Abrams tanks. ICV says the Kremlin's broader objective is to block weapons that would allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russia's rear and degrade critical military infrastructure. The think tank's assessments include force structure estimates and strike capacity calculations. Institute of Study of War reports that Russian nightly strike package increased markedly throughout 2025, averaging 187 long-range drones per night in September 2025, compared with 83 per night in January, and that Russia has accelerated Shahid production by expanding facilities such as the Yellow Buddha factory. ICU also estimates that at least 1,945 Russian military objectives lie within a range of 2,500-kilometer Tomahawk variant, and at least 1,655 are within a range of 1,600-kilometer variant, meaning Tomahawk transfers could put a large portion of Russia's rare infrastructure at risk. Finally, Institute of Study of War notes Ukraine's reported efforts to develop long-range strike capability, including a domestically produced Flamingo cruise missile, claimed to have a 3,000-kilometer range and roughly 1,150-kilogram warhead, but stresses the system remains unproven and would require time and production capacity to become operational at scale. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has introduced a sweeping ceasefire and reconstruction plan aimed at ending the ongoing Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, according to multiply U.S. media outlets. The proposal, discussed with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during a high-profile meeting at the White House on September 29th, lays out a 20-point framework that includes concessions, ceasefire, and creation of interim governing body in Gaza. According to Reuters, Trump's plan includes the following elements: ceasefire, Israel would hold its military operations in Gaza, and Hamas would release all remaining Israeli hostages in 72 hours. Prisoner exchange. In return, Israel would release approximately 1,700 Palestinian detainees, including 250 prisoners. Gaza would be temporarily overseen by an international technocratic body called the Board of Peace, chaired by Trump and including international figures such as former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Hamas fighters who agree to disarm or leave Gaza would be granted amnesty. International donors, including Gulf states, would coordinate a $45 billion reconstruction package under Western oversight. Prime Minister Netanyahu has publicly supported the plan, calling it a critical step toward ending hostilities. However, he added several caveats, including that Israel would retain control over Gaza's borders and security perimeters. He also emphasized that full withdrawal would depend on verified Hamas disarmament and guarantees for Israeli civilians. At the same time, Netanyahu faces sharp resistance from far-right members of his coalition. According to Reuters, ultranationalist ministers have warned that any deal perceiving as legitimizing Hamas, even temporarily, would be a red line. Hamas has reportedly expressed conditional support for parts of Trump's plan, including the prisoner exchange, ceasefire, but has requested revisions to proposal related to demilitarization and foreign governance. Talks are ongoing, and the full response is still being negotiated through intermediaries in Qatar and Egypt. This marks a significant departure from Trump's earlier proposal in February 2025, in which he suggested the U.S. temporarily assume administrative control over Gaza, potentially relocating parts of the population, a plan that drew strong criticism from Arab allies and humanitarian groups. The Financial Times and Reuters have reported that senior Trump advisors, including Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, have been deeply involved in pushing this plan forward. U.S. officials say the administration is now in the final stages of securing buy-in from both Israeli and Palestinian leadership, as well as key regional actors such as Egypt, Jordan, and United Arab Emirates. Trump has used strong language to pressure both sides, warning Hamas that failure to comply would result in complete obliteration, and asserting that Israel must show strategic discipline. According to U.S. analysts, the plan's success will depend on several factors: whether Hamas agrees to a full disarmament, whether Israeli right-wing leadership remains unified, whether regional and Western allies commit the necessary resources to reconstruction. However, critics of the plan, including some in the U.S. foreign policy, argue that it centralizes too much power in Washington, bypasses Palestinian sovereignty, and risks long-term instability if Hamas is not fully removed from power. Still, U.S. officials say the humanitarian situation in Gaza, rising regional tensions, and domestic pressure are pushing all sides closer to a political resolution. Meanwhile, U.S. is pressuring its allies to withdraw support from a United Nations resolution calling for an end to the decades-long U.S. embargo on Cuba, citing Havana's alleged military involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine. In diplomatic cable dated on October 2nd, that reviewed by Reuters, State Department instructed U.S. embassies around the globe to urge partners' governments to vote against, or at least to abstain from, the annual General Assembly resolution, which Havana has used for years to rally international condemnation of U.S. sanctions. The push marks a significant escalation in Washington's campaign to isolate the Cuban government, with the administration pointing to intelligence suggesting that between 1,000 and 5,000 Cuban fighters are participating in Russia's war effort against Ukraine. The cable reported describes Cuba as the second largest contributor of foreign forces to Russia after North Korea. For decades, UN vote has been overwhelmingly landslide in favor of Cuba. Last year, 187 countries voted for the resolution calling on the US to lift the embargo, with only the US and Israel opposing and single abstention from Moldova. Washington now appears to be trying to reframe the debate from a sanctions and sovereignty issue into the use of military aggression and authoritarian alliance. According to Reuters, the cable characterized Cuba's support for Russia as evidence of Havana's disregard for global peace and democratic values, arguing that it is squandering limited resources while denying its people basic freedoms. U.S. diplomats are instructed to tell foreign counterparts that Cuba's economic crisis is not due to sanctions, but due to corruption and incompetence. The Cuban government has denied any formal military deployment to Ukraine. Havana has previously acknowledged the presence of Cuban nationalists in Russia, but claims many may have been recruited by private military contractors without state authorization. Cuba's permanent mission to UN has not commented on this issue. However, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez has denounced the US campaign, accusing Washington of using foreign policy to escalate hostilities against Ireland. The diplomatic push comes as President Trump administration takes harder line on Cuba after returning to the office in January. The administration has reinstated Cuba's designation as a state of terrorism, reimposed strict travel restrictions, and cracked down on international firms doing business with Havana. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and glory to Ukraine.